With no further ado, we have a special guest. Today is National Anthem Day, and we have with us Sir Francis Scott Key. Come on in.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Francis Scott Key, and I have come here to tell you the true story of our national anthem. You see, I was born in 1779. When I turned 4 years of age, my parents sat me down. Now, even before I was 4, they read to me Bible stories. They told me what a wonderful person Jesus Christ was to lay down his life for my sin. And then they also said that the people who follow him, who believe in the Bible, become courageous. They will do things others won't do. And when I had turned 4, they told me a story of a man by the name of George Washington. For that very year I turned 4, he had gone to Annapolis, near where I lived, in the state of Maryland. And there he had resigned his commission. He had been the commander-in-chief to fight for our nation's independence. And then, when the war was over, he handed that commission back to the civil government. He didn't become a king, and he didn't think the nation should continue to operate by force. He gave it up. I remember my parents telling me that story and telling me that that was a great man who didn't need to rule by force, but submitted to law. I didn't really understand everything they said when I first heard it. But by the time I was 10, my parents said it would be very good for me to go away to school and to study hard and to study all the kinds of subjects that I should. I said, well, what kind of subjects will I study? They told me trigonometry, geometry, algebra, Latin, Greek. Why, I would learn the languages the scriptures were in. So I went away to St. John's College. By the time I got there, I realized I began to study only the second year. A little past that, we all heard, all the students. I was 12. And we heard all the students. We were going to see George Washington. He was coming as President of the United States through to our campus on one of his tours of the nation. Why, we all came out. We stood. This is the man I heard my parents teach me about. I would finally get to see him. Sure enough, he came to our campus. I watched as he rode through on that carriage. I said, now there's a great man. My parents had told me about it, and now I knew. After all, I was living at my uncle's house. I was named after, my middle name came after him, of Scott, and so I felt very proud to be there. But then I had seen him. Soon after George Washington had left, though, a stir came in the campus because a book had been written by Thomas Paine. He had written Common Sense back in 1775, but now we thought all his common sense had gone, because he wrote this book called The Age of Reason, where he said, God does not exist. You should not do it. And he even wrote slanderous things about the people we considered heroes. Some students said they would not lay eyes on such a book, for it dishonored Jesus Christ as Lord. A few of us said it needs answering. So we read it, and I was part of writing the apology for the Bible in defense of Christianity against that rascal Thomas Paine, who had, when he was in prison during the French Revolution, abandoned all decency and thought, come to find out, he had borrowed much of what he wrote earlier from other people's coattails, didn't really believe it himself. But along to my story, I tell you that because deep within my heart, I love Jesus. And I believe Christianity was the only thing that could save our nation and maintain her. And the only time you should go to war is when it's just. And your best defense is submission to God. It's not your armaments. Soon talk of war had reached us. By this time, I was a practicing attorney. I had taken up cases, eventually before the Supreme Court, where I defended law, even when individuals who were rascals, had been put in prison unjustly, I would defend the rule of law even if the person in jail was not a good person. Because if you don't defend law, you will end up having a government of men and anarchy will rule. So I was criticized in a great deal. But now, when the War of 1812 began, I disagreed with President Madison. I said, you do not need a war. We do not need a war right now. We're not ready for a war. I didn't mean, oh yeah, we only had 7 naval ships, 5,000 in the army. We were not ready to fight England. We weren't ready for war, but that's not what I meant. I meant we're not ready for a war because our people have lost that hunger that they once had for God. They no longer worship like they used to. They no longer believe like they used to. Why, by the time of 1812, I feared, and I had written, I feared that our nation was losing the very consciousness of the God that had birthed her in the first place. And I said, we can't do that. Why, we must stay true to God. Well, I had written a poem, and I had written it to a song when we had fought the Barbary pirates, and we won. And I had said, as I wrote it, to the tune that I had loved, the tune that I had figured would be captured as a patriotic tune for our nation. And I had said, you know, that when I wrote that, I wanted all America to rejoice when we had won because we had fought for what was right. For mixed with the laurel, I said mixed with the olive because the olive was a symbol of peace that came from the ark of Noah and had always been considered that. Mixed with the olive, the laurels shall wave and form a bright wreath for the brows of the brave. I'd written a poem to a certain tune and set it ablaze in 1807. I wrote poems all the time as a pastime. So now to the story. Here it was. And we were not doing well in the War of 1812. We wanted to invade Canada. That was against the law of nations. I had defended the law of nations before bars and courts and before people saying you can only fight a war when it's just. You don't think of invading a neutral country. You don't feel of doing that just to try to morally hurt the other country. It's wrong. And America was not doing well. But then an event took place in early 1814. Napoleon was defeated in Europe. And now the British sent forth all their troops to our nation. And then they sailed into the harbors. I knew we were in trouble. Why, at this point, when the British had started to attack, I realized now we must be defended. I even served in the militia for a short time in 1813. And now, in 1814, I realized we were in trouble. The troops began to come. Why, our militia couldn't even fight. There was just not something beating in their breasts like I had learned from the American Revolution. Something wasn't there. We were defeated at the Battle of Bladensburg, and now the troops were coming, and they were coming toward Washington. I can remember that night in August. I took out the spyglass. I looked to try to see what's happening. They came. Our troops ran in total fear. They ran away from the British that were coming. And I found out later what I had watched with my wife, Mary, at whom we had 11 children eventually, but I knew on the back porch, as I looked at it, I saw flames coming from our nation's capital. And I'd heard the story. I'd heard the story that President Madison wanted to lift the troops and had remembered because his friend George Washington had done it. Why, he'd left the White House, he'd gotten on the carriage and on horseback and rode himself to the head of the militia to inspire them to fight the British. And Dolly, his wife, was the only one left with a few servants in the White House. And she said, why, if I was a man, I'd put a cannon in every window and fight for the symbol of this nation until the death. She kept getting messages from the president saying, leave, leave, the British are coming, leave. No, I will not leave, she said. Till finally one of the trusted aides had come and told her, you've got to get out of the White House. You've got to get out now. The British are only a few miles away. So she finally said, okay, as she started to walk through the state dining room, while she had just had the servants prepare a big meal so that President Madison could come back and dine with her in celebration of how the militia had driven the British back at Bladensburg. That didn't happen that way. The dinner's on the table. She begins to move. Catching her eye is Gilbert's famous painting of George Washington. Just over the stateroom, she said to the servants, take that. I will not have the enemy destroy and mock the father of our country. They couldn't get it off the wall, and we don't have the tools. Break the frame, but take the picture. They did. Walking out, she saw a copy of the Declaration of Independence. Rolling that up, she put it in the carriage. She gathered everything she could and rode out just in time. The British didn't go to the White House first. They went to the Capitol. When they came in the Capitol, they had all the soldiers sit in the seats of the Congress. The general came to the front, said, all right, let's have a democratic meeting for the despised United States and the hated function of democracy. I, who will have a motion that this building be burned to the ground? Aye, 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 aye. Then let's pass it by a resolution and burn this building. Soon the Capitol's in flames. Then they went to the White House. They came in, and after tasting the dinner that was prepared for the president, his wife, and his guests, they broke every window. They took all the furniture, piled it in the middle of the rooms, and they set the White House ablaze. As I watched with a spyglass to see the flames coming on my beloved country, I raised my hands to God and I said, oh God, this is your judgment to come upon a people who no longer follow you the way they should. Oh God, make it as minimal as possible. Bring us back to you. Sure enough, the way that God's providence works. In the middle of the night, a strange thunderstorm appeared and put out the flames in the Capitol and the White House. Yes, they were shells the next morning, but something was left. A small bit of what we once were. But as the British retreated, realizing they better not stay in Washington, they began to leave and head to Baltimore. They said, when we get Baltimore, the third largest city in America, it's over. We will now have the United States back where they should be, one of our colonies. As they were retreating, some British soldiers who did not have their uniforms on and were not looking like soldiers at all began looting homes on the way. Well, my good friend, Dr. Beams, who was 65 years of age, and he was a good friend. The reason why is he was a good man. Not only was he a good man and a Christian, he had been ministering to all the wounded British soldiers that were leaving Washington, that had fought in the other battles around the city. And he had ministered to them just as he had ministered to those who he counted as fellow Americans. But when he saw stragglers going into his backyard that night, he, like he should, called on the authorities and had them arrested and put in prison for stealing from his private property. He said, I'll minister to a British soldier, but I'm going to stand up against any looter. He didn't know the looters were soldiers. When it reached the British, they sent a detachment back and they arrested Dr. Beans. At 65 years of age, they put him on a horse and they took him all the way down to the ship and put it on as a prisoner of war. Now, for someone to be taken as a prisoner of war who was helping both sides is a violation of the law of nations. Immediately, I recognized the British cannot get away with this. Getting a truce, a flag of truce from President Madison, my good friend, I said to him, we need to go. By taking the Agent Skinner, we went down, and under a flag of truce, we sailed toward the British fleet in the bay. They took us on board. And when they took us on board, I showed them the letters I had collected from all the British soldiers who had been helped by my friend Dr. Beans. I had them signed by them, and they attested this is a man of true Christian character. Why, the general looked at me and said, why, I must admit you are accurate. This is a violation. We beg your apology. We will release your doctor friend, but I'm afraid we can't release you now. Well, why is that? Well, if you look around, Mr. Key, you see that we're on a mission. So you're just going to have to stay here and watch your beloved Baltimore fall into our hands. because now you know the strength of our bombardment. He had hardly noticed, but he saw all the ships. And then he suddenly realized by the talk, the British were going to take Baltimore not just by sea, but by land. They were going to send troops on one side and then send a special boat filled with soldiers at the dead of night and sneak into the fort on the other side, knowing the fort had only 1,500 men, and they were sending thousands and thousands of soldiers. I began to realize, oh, Lord, what are you going to do? Well, 1 year before, the Major General had ordered Mary Pickersgill, who was a widow, and her only surviving daughter, Caroline, to make the largest flag possible. She had to do it in sections. Why, each stripe was 2 feet in length. Each star was 2 feet in diameter. And she had made the massive flag, 30 feet by 42-foot flag with 15 stars, one for every state in the Union, and 15 stripes. And she had to make a second one also, called a battle flag that would fly during the battle. The other large flag was to be raised on the victory. And she had made them. Now, I was on board the ship, and it was getting to be night. A soldier came over, and he saw me with my spyglass, looking out toward the fort. And he said, "Key, look well to that little flag, for it's not going to fly in the morning." I turned to Dr. Beans. "What do you say?" Dr. Beans said, "Oh, I ache. I pray for my nation." All during the night, the bombardment continued. The British kept bombarding, and they had a new weapon called a rocket red glare. Not been used in battle before, but it was a rocket they would fire that would be so hot that when it would land, it would burst and the shrapnel would do tremendous damage. And I watched as those rockets, red glare, would be shot off the ships, and the return fire from the Americans, which wouldn't reach the boats. The British pulled just out of reach of our guns, but their guns kept bombarding that fort, pound after pound. They kept bombarding it all during the night. I wondered what would happen. Through the mist, I could see the tiny flag, but only with my spyglass. I could see that tiny flag flying until the morning. When we got up, I came up just before dawn, and I began looking. The smoke filled the air. I'd found out something that had happened. Why, the British, after midnight, were going with muffled oars to land. One young man who was at the fort just happened to see the British coming, lit one of the bales of hay, and exposed the entire secret attack, and had blown the barge back. The British had lost that one. And then when they had come on the other side by land to try to capture the fort, on the other side, the British were driven back by the most spirited defense at all. And you know why? The British realized the worst thing they could have done was to burn the White House and burn the Capitol. It put passion in those troops in Baltimore that nothing else had done. Why, if you're going to mock us, we're going to fight. And the British were absolutely shocked. They had not seen anything like this in the War of 1812 and were driven back by land. They now had been driven back by water, and the fort still stood. So in the morning, I took an envelope and I began to write a poem. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light? As I penned the words, all of a sudden I realized I was looking at a flag without my spyglass. Unknowing it, in the morning, they had taken the battle flag down and they'd put up Mary Pickersgill's flag, the most giant flag I'd ever seen in my life. I didn't even need the spyglass to see it. It was so big. I was 8 miles from the fort by water, and I could see it without any magnification. And then I realized, when I came ashore with Dr. Beans and Mr. Skinner, the agent, I went to the very tavern that George Washington dined at the beginning of the war, at the end of the war, and before his inauguration, the Fountain Inn. And there, God and I finished my poem. And I realized I will leave to America my own passion by letting her know the only time you should fight and your true motto. And I wrote that final verse. And I said, though conquer we must, when our cause it is just. This be our motto. In God is our trust. And that is the story of our national anthem. God bless you. March 3, 1931 is when the Congress made this our national anthem. Does anyone know what two other songs were our unwritten official national anthems before the national anthem? Hail Columbia, which is now the official hymn of the Vice President of the United States, and My Country 'Tis of Thee, written right here in Massachusetts, was the other unofficial national anthem until March 3rd when President Hoover signed it into law. So you know today, you can tell people today, this is National Anthem Day. What have you done for National Anthem Day? You can let them know. And at least we're going to sing all 4 verses. Most people don't know there's any more than the first verse.